Welcome to Mindshift. I'm Brandon. Today is episode 42 of my secular Bible study series in which we are looking at Luke. I know this is the third gospel in a row that we've covered, and things might begin to feel a bit redundant. But bear with me here because there are some vast differences. I'm hoping that you've already seen that in what we've covered between Mark and Matthew. As we approach Luke, we're going to see yet another difference, and then John takes it out of the park. So each of these, I think, can really help explain how we got the religion of Christianity that we have today, and you can see this evolution. The Jesus in Luke needs to be one of social justice. The Jesus in Luke needs to be kinder. No more calling Peter the devil. No more being angry before he heals people. We're going to leave those out. We're also going to focus more on how it's not the Romans' fault, it's the Jewish people's fault that Jesus had to be crucified. And furthermore, we need this to start reaching that Roman and larger audience. So let's include new parables never seen before in the other gospel accounts that show the Good Samaritan or the prodigal son. Let's make this Jesus for everybody, a true Son of Man, where John will give us the Son of God. And so those are the four distinctions I see between the gospels and that scholars rightly point out. And so that's what I'm going to try to help illustrate for you today without being nearly as redundant. In fact, we're going to breeze through point one, which is where we typically take a lot of time. I'm going to break down the book of Luke into four segments for you. Part one will be chapters 1 and 2, where we return to a birth narrative. We didn't get that in Mark, we only got it in Matthew. And like Matthew, we need this to be magical. We need this to be a virgin birth. And let's not stop there. Let's make John the Baptist's birth also very special, very magical. That should add some emphasis to even the person who comes to support who will become the Messiah had to be endowed with power and blessing. We'll add songs and poems from an elderly couple and from Mary herself so that we can make sure that this is a joyous occasion. Segment 2, we'll do a large reach here, chapters 3 through 9. We'll just call it Jesus's early ministry or his teachings. And this is where we get 3 brand new parables. I mentioned 2 already, the parable of the prodigal son, the Good Samaritan, and also the rich young fool. Whoever is writing the Gospel of Luke here, again, has a mission. They are making this Jesus one of social justice, one of inclusion. Women get the absolute best treatment according to the Gospel of Luke. The rich are criticized more than in any of the other Gospels. Jesus here is a real man of the people, and everyone's included, and everyone's forgiven, and it's all sunshine and rainbows. We get a happier Jesus. It's so funny. Some of my criticisms in what we've covered in the last few Sunday videos, as well as in the other 2 gospel accounts, are you wouldn't expect this of Jesus, his anger, his snippiness with those who are just trying to follow him and just trying to understand his teachings. And there are some things that are not very kind in Luke. So I'm not saying he got a complete character redone, but they, while including the same stories, left out a lot of the snarkier parts of Jesus. They also left out a lot of the weaker parts of Jesus. I'm going to get to all of this in Contradictions. I'm really jumping ahead. Let's get back on track. Segment 3 will be chapters 9 through 19, the journey to Jerusalem. We get more parables here, emphasizing the joy in inclusion, again, with parables like the lost coin or the lost sheep. Again, really reflecting that theme of universal salvation, which is just not what you would get. I just feel it's important to say it once again. Jesus was a Jewish man preaching and teaching to a Jewish following about the Jewish God. Everything that has been spun after the fact, a spiritual kingdom instead of a physical kingdom as was expected for the Messiah. Jesus himself being the third temple instead of building the third temple and maintaining it. Unifying the 12 disciples to represent the 12 tribes of Israel instead of actually bringing the tribes together and unifying them as one as was expected for the Messiah. We get this complete flipping of the script. But again, ahead of myself in a few regards. And then the 4th segment is just going to be the final chapters in Luke, 19 through 24, where we have Jesus in Jerusalem, and we have all of the things that accompany that. We do get some new appearances from Jesus to different people after the resurrection, so we'll definitely include those when we get to Contradictions. A lot of the same emphasis on the triumphal entry, some very huge differences within the trial, again, shifting the blame onto the Jews or the high priest and away from the government of Rome. We're going to leave out the improper treatment of the Romans. They were just doing the jobs that the Jews tasked them with. And we'll end the book with the ascension of Jesus, which ties it directly to Acts. So many of you might not be aware of this. Acts is a sequel to Luke, thought to be written by the same author. These two books show an immediacy happening. Jesus dies, is resurrected, reveals himself, ascends, and then bam, the immediate work of the apostles, thus leading to the Acts of the Apostles. So that's it. Look how fast we did book overview. I told you I was going to try so hard not to be too redundant for you. Let's move straight into point 2, which is authorship and date. Now, traditional authorship goes to Luke, who was a companion of Paul, and thus an excuse for why we see this inclusion of the Gentile in Luke that we don't necessarily see in the other Gospels as clearly. Luke was known as a physician, which many people like to point out his attention to detail. After all, he starts the book, and maybe this should have been something I read to you in point 1. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word and have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all these things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. We see there that detail-oriented side of Luke, which backs up the traditional aspect of him being a physician. But I think what's important here to understand is that he has a patron who is paying him to write this. Now, there's a ton of debate about who Theophilus was, but even calling him most excellent makes him sound like he's Roman, a Roman official of some import. And thus, it's almost like he's getting his own crafted narrative from Luke that definitely, again, compare it with Mark, paints Rome in a completely different light and opens up the salvation of Jesus to everyone instead of a message for the Jews. Now, there's another side to this, Theophilus meaning lover of God or friend of God, that this is really just kind of a in-place symbolic name for a group or even still maybe an individual that was already following this God and wanted someone to go out and do the diligent work of checking. What's amazing is in checking the work, in getting more details, in talking to more eyewitnesses about a lot of things that eyewitnesses could definitely just not have been a part of, like the prayers in Gethsemane, etc. We get so many different stories, additions, and then completely left off accounts of things that happened in Mark. So to one degree, you'd have to think, oh, if this is the more accurate gospel, the parts that it contradicts with Mark, we shouldn't have Mark at all. And the things that it adds on top of Mark can't contradict Mark because they're simply not there. But it looks like a lot of poetic license for the writer of Luke to just make the narrative go the way that his patron wanted it to go. A conflict of interest, to say the very least, if not pure bias and ultimate contradiction. There are mutually exclusive character traits of Jesus between these Gospels. But back to the traditional authorship debate, it's backed up by a couple early resources. The Muratorian canon, as well as some of the early church fathers, specifically Origen and Tertullian and Irenaeus. And to be fair, unlike some of the other Gospels, some scholars actually do appoint this to the traditional authorship of Luke. It lines up a lot with him being a companion of Paul and the differences that we see that would have been influenced by Paul's teaching that is a very different kind of idea about this Jewish Messiah. But others take issues with that as well, and we get into the timing aspects. We know that this was after the destruction of the temple. We have references in Luke to the fall of Jerusalem, and most scholars put the dating of Luke between 80 and 90 is late. The latest I've seen from a scholarly approach is up to 110 CE. I think that 80 to 90 is just fine and still doesn't really change the total ordering of things here. It's interesting to see how it compares with Acts, and there's so much I want to say, and it's going to bring up so much of the contradictions, and Acts contradicts even other things that Paul writes, and so having Luke as a companion of Paul also looks problematic because we have some for sure non-forgery articles from Paul, and yet what we see in Acts is so different than that. And so we'll talk about that when we get into the epistles and when we get into Acts. Let's try to stay in the gospel. That's my fault. I've already covered textual variants and early manuscripts in the other gospels, and I will say that Luke has a more consistent core, less textual variants than what we see with Matthew and Mark. But let's move right into point 4. That's right, we're skipping point 3. We've talked about it enough. Nothing has changed. We're in the same time and place. We understand the relations to the Gospels with what was going on in first century Judea, Galilee, Jerusalem, etc. Let's talk about a literary analysis. The first thing that I want to say here, and also a addition to what I've said about Matthew and Mark, is just to understand what this is. The writers of any of these Gospels did not think themselves to be writing the New Testament. They were familiar with many parts of the Old Testament as we are today, and to them this is a continuation. There had been huge periods of breaks before in the Old Testament, and 400 years, though long, is nothing new. We have new information. We have a new prophet on the scene. This prophet just so happens to be the Messiah, which is what was predicted. So now we're going to write about it. Some people like Luke are obviously being paid to write about it. Others might be doing it for an early church or of their own volition. They are ancient biographies, the life and teaching and death, and in this case, resurrection of a figure. And I think it's important to understand that. Now, they're all obviously biased. This isn't a biography being written by an opposing side, and nor are these eyewitness testimonies. But it's not as if there weren't Christians at this time. This belief system was already in place. People were talking about this for decades, and the stories were evolving. The myth and the lore were growing, the gaps were being filled, and while doing so, created more contradictions that then led to more things needed to being added on, and that's why we have the vast array of things that we have from these 4 accounts, let alone the other accounts that simply did not even make it into the Gospels. They at least reflect, even if you were a Christian and believe these are the only correct 4, they still reflect what was being said about this Jesus at this time. I wanted to point that out. They're ancient biographies written from biased sources, especially when one is being paid most likely to put this together. The writing style here, I think, is of note. It is extremely precise and concise, but also elegant. It's a notable difference here with the other Gospels. We have a very strong command of language, and for that, I appreciate this Gospel. We have a good chronological structure, which is true for most of the Gospels, although some jump around, or like Mark starts late and then has issues with its ending. But Luke is pretty straightforward all the way through. In terms of techniques, Luke is heavy on the parables. Matthew is as well, but we get even extras within Luke. We get more dialogue. Again, things that were just straightforward and not said at all in Mark. We're going to heavily expand on them in Luke. We're just going to create dialogue so that Jesus can give exposition to what is going on. You'll see that in some of what I cover in problematic passages, or the additional story of the 2 men that Jesus appears to. It is like preaching, not recounting a story. It is obviously there to just fill gaps and tell the reader something, but we're supposed to take it as a true story. It's just crazy. Luke is also a fan of motifs, his most significant being that of the lost and found, whether it is the coin, the sheep, or the sun. This is something he plays with a lot, and there's a few other examples like that. But let's move straight into point 5, main themes. Marginalized groups. Can't be mad at it, even though it's a clear addition and a real change, especially in how he has to manipulate some of the stories. At least women, the poor, the Gentiles are getting some representation and some affiliation or inclusion within the salvation that Jesus is supposedly offering. That salvation itself is point 2. We hear a lot about repentance, about faith and grace. Again, that is even more hyper-specific to Luke than the previous 2 Gospels. I think we should have called the first theme there inclusion, and we'll call the third one here social justice. Lots of focus on wealth, on generosity, on the treatment of the poor. And lastly, going back to the motif we talked about, a theme of forgiveness, again referenced by the prodigal son and the good Samaritan. So we are rapid firing, and as you know, we are skipping point 6 because to talk about the influence of the Gospels is to talk about the influence of Christianity, and that deserves a lot more than a 4 to 6 minute segment in a secular Bible study series. I'm not ignoring it. I'm not denying that influence. I'm respecting the influence enough to say we're not going to cover it here now. So let's move into point 7 and let's turn to the list that I have ready for us of both contradictions and problematic passages. And we will start with contradictions. Oh, and again, so important to highlight here, not all are going to be direct contradictions. I'm covering differences as well. Both things could exist, but the focus from these different authors of these different vantage points is the most generous term we could give here, show an issue in concocting a story to look a different way, and ultimately leads to a different version of this Jesus, let alone all of the times that we actually do have these direct contradictions. But let's start with the genealogy of Jesus. Luke is interesting because we trace the genealogy all the way back to Adam, emphasizing Jesus's universal significance. Again, this Son of Man aspect that we're going to have flowing throughout this gospel. Where in Matthew, it's from Abraham to Joseph, signifying the importance of his Jewishness and being in the right bloodline. Again, if you go from Abraham to Adam, you're fine, not a total contradiction, but you're trying to get a whole different version of Jesus here by focusing on the information differently. All right, how about the infancy narratives? Luke includes the census, the journey to Bethlehem, the manger, and the shepherds, where Matthew is the Magi, the flight to Egypt, the massacre of the innocents, with no mention of the census or the shepherds. And the census is an issue. I guess maybe I shouldn't have skipped point 3 and just talk about how we do know that this census would not have made any sense. I'll make a side video on it so we don't have to worry about it here because there's a lot to talk about there. And by the way, that census would have been just another plot device tool to get Jesus where he needed to be. Matthew just went about it in a different way. Some differences do equal contradictions. The temptations of Jesus between Luke 4 and Matthew 4 are different in both order and what they are. The calling of the disciples is different. In Luke 5, we get the miraculous catching of fish, and then the calling of the first disciple, Simon Peter, where in Matthew, we have a different order of events and an emphasis on Jesus's call to discipleship. The resurrection narratives are, of course, different, and I know I'm jumping back and forth in timeline, but in Luke 24, we have the women finding the empty tomb. We also have encounters with angels and appearances to the disciples on the road to Emmaus and in Jerusalem and the ascension. But in Matthew, we have the women finding the empty tomb, but an earthquake, the appearance to the women and disciples in Galilee, and no mention of the road to Emmaus or the ascension. Also, can we take a second to talk about how the only two places that the ascension is talked about is in Luke and Acts? Like, this is a significant thing to have left out in the other gospels. It's almost tiring to continue to point out the insanity of the differences between them. It's like, I know them all, I've seen them all, I've made peace with the fact that this is obviously just not an accurate telling, that there's myth and lore going into this, but to see people that just continue to believe these things, that quote from gospel to gospel with whatever suits their needs, without focusing or understanding on the differences and contradictions, it's crazy to me. But anyways, let's keep going. Jesus' birthplace is different. Luke records that Joseph and Mary traveled from Nazareth to Bethlehem for a census, and Jesus was born and laid in a manger. But Matthew indicates that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, but does not mention a census. We've talked about the differences with the anointing of Jesus. We've covered Judas's death. The last words of Jesus, again, I have to point out, because we're talking about the difference here of how Luke is trying to improve Jesus. So in Matthew and Mark, we have that, my God, why have you forsaken me? But Luke wants Jesus to take ownership back over what is happening here on the cross. And so in Luke 23, it's, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit, as if Jesus is making this whole thing happen. Also different from John, where we just get, it is finished. In Luke, as mentioned, we do get Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and other women finding the tomb, where in Matthew, we still get women, but it's just Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. One amazing contradiction with Luke is about the ascension, and the only other place we have to compare it with is supposedly the same author who wrote Acts, because in Luke 24, Jesus' ascension is occurring in Bethany on the day of his resurrection. But in Acts, it's on the Mount of Olives 40 days after the fact. And I think as I look at these, we've covered all the rest for the most part between Matthew and Mark so far, and there's some that I want to save that are specific to John. And again, I can't just recommend you enough to go read these accounts side by side, because I just simply can't cover everything here. But with that said, let's move on to problematic passages. Okay, I have a lot written down. I'm not sure how many I'm going to cover, but let's just get started. Luke 12:49 through 53. I have come to bring fire on the earth, and how I wish it were here already kindled. But I have a baptism to undergo, and what constraint I am under until it is completed. Do you think I came to bring peace on earth? No, I tell you, but division. So much for the peace bringer, so much for the unifier, so much for hippie Jesus, the spirit of the law, and forgetting the contradictions about the character of Jesus versus other Jesus, or Jesus versus Yahweh. What a gross verse. What a terrible excuse for a perfect God of divine justice. And all Christians can do is talk about the value of family, a God-given value, a right, the most important thing to protect against the evils of the world, where Jesus doesn't even care to protect it. Don't go bury your father. Hate your kids and leave them if you must. I am here to cause division. These are his words. If you're going to believe it, you have to believe all of it. But all of it is a big pill to swallow. And by the way, stick around because the last one I'm going to cover is one of the most problematic passages in the New Testament. But let's go to Luke 22:36. He said to them, "But now if you have a purse, take it, and also a bag. And if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one." So much for blessed are the peacemakers from the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew. But here we have what we see in, by the way, all of the gospel accounts. Jesus as zealot, Jesus as someone who believed himself to be on the path to raising up the Jews and restoring them even politically. He just died first, and then we have the alterations afterwards to make sense of it. And in doing so, we try to make this Jesus about forgiveness and salvation. And so there's a whole lot. I'm not saying the pretty parts aren't in here. They are. But so are these parts. Luke 10:10-15, "But when you enter a town and are not welcomed, go into the streets and say, 'Even the dust of your town we wipe from our feet as a warning to you. Yet be sure of this, the kingdom of God is come near. I tell you, it will be more bearable on that day for Sodom than for that town.'" We do like to point out the differences between Jesus and Yahweh. But here, all I see is Yahweh. In the Old Testament, Yahweh tells his people to go to a town and offer them peace. And by the way, he describes that peace. Everyone stops right there. He describes that peace as essentially letting them be slaves for you. And if they refuse the peace offered, go and utterly destroy them. Kudos to Jesus for being consistent here, because this is the same thing. Go into the towns and give them the opportunity to what? To be Jesus' slaves. This is what Jesus calls us to be. See my entire video on slave mentality of Jesus. It didn't pop out of nowhere. It popped out of all of the times that Jesus talked about the right, proper attitude and positioning of oneself in following him. It is to be made slave. And if they reject it, wipe the dust off your feet, move to the next town as a warning to them. Because what comes for them if they reject Jesus and his peace and love will be a fate worse than that of Sodom and Gomorrah. When you put the last few verses together along with this one, you see Christianity almost being told to spread at the tip of the sword. Convert or else. Not quite so pretty. Luke 14:26, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple." Hyperbole or not, this is Jesus above everything else. This is not about family. This isn't about loving your family as an act of loving Jesus. It's if push comes to shove, it better be Jesus. And how many terrible things have happened to children because of this verse and verses like it? How many people were told that their parents love this invisible imaginary figure more than they love their own children? And that was just the parents doing what they thought was the correct thing. This has tons of implications for how we view ourselves. We must hate our own life to follow Jesus. We must deny ourselves, these kinds of things. It's just awful. What about Luke 6:29-30? "If someone slaps you on one cheek, turn to them the other also. If someone takes your coat, do not withhold your shirt from them. Give to everyone who asks you, and if anyone takes what belongs to you, do not demand it back." Not only is this completely hypocritical, as you'll see from my video on loving your enemies. If you didn't see that, check it out. I also talk about some of the harm in that episode, so I'm not going to cover it too much here, but it is not love or compassion to just be completely vulnerable and railroaded. And again, I'm not saying that this verse doesn't have some elements of a radical idea of love or inclusion, because Luke has this. Luke is this real dichotomy. But why do we have to be on either extreme? Why do we have to say to a city, you will have a fate worse than Sodom and Gomorrah if you deny me and my teaching? And also, turn the other cheek. Take everything I have. I won't fight back. Buy a sword. Hate your family. Oh, you wanted my coat? Here's this also. Like, what is going on here? It's not my fault these things aren't reconciled. I've talked about Luke 8:32-33 so many times I can't do it again, but that is the demon possession with the large herd of pigs and all the things wrong with that. I mentioned Luke 9:60 earlier, where someone was told not to go bury their dead father so that they could follow Christ. In Luke 13:24, "Make every effort to enter through the narrow door, because many, I tell you, will try to enter and will not be able to." The idea idea that many will try and fail makes it sound like salvation cannot be guaranteed, that many will think they are and are not, which means that for every single one of you in the comments who tells me, no, I am assured of this, I know this, you're contradicting Jesus. But you're also not contradicting him, because Jesus says the same thing you're saying in other places, or people have it being said for Jesus, like what John will do and what Paul will do for us. So I guess it's the own internal inconsistencies that are your problem, but it's definitely not me. Okay, Luke 17:32-33. Remember Lot's wife? Whoever tries to keep their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life will preserve it. Again, promoting self-denial to such an extreme degree as a religious tenet is obviously cultish and harmful. Why make us if you don't want us to be us? Luke 10:19, similar to that ending in Mark, we get, I have given you authority to trample on snakes and scorpions and to overcome all the power of the enemy. Nothing will harm you. What a lack of practical guidance. Superstitious, mystical powers. You thought we were done away with that in the Old Testament. It continues on in the character of Christ because of course it does. But modern Christians love to divorce themselves of that reality, and you can't when you read the text. In Luke 17:34-35, Jesus says, I tell you, on that night, 2 people will be in one bed. One will be taken and the other left. 2 women will be grinding grain together. One will be taken, the other left. Again, this idea of salvation not being something we can know for certain or being guaranteed, this exclusionary purposes of Christ, this fear-based salvation. You better try. Do your best. You don't want to be left behind. Your fate will be worse than Sodom. Remember Lot's wife? So many examples like this in Luke, where we see the fear-based teaching that is so well known in at least American churches, but they're just following the gospel. Luke 6:24-25. Woe to you who are rich, for you have already received your comfort. Woe to you who are well fed now, for you will go hungry. Woe to you who laugh now, for you will mourn and weep. Listen, I understand that comfort and wealth can potentially lead to things that are not in our best interest. But saying these things are inherently bad and that by having them, you deserve a comeuppance is also promoting the idea that to be a follower of Christ, one must be downtrodden. No wonder there's a slave mentality in Christianity. Don't do well now, or I'll take you down. Suffer for me, and then I will lift you up. But the Bible is so vague and contradictory that you can also get an entire prosperity gospel from it as well. But these verses exist too, and they're ridiculous. Of course, there's the Luke 9:23, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. The hypocrisy of this statement from Jesus in Luke 11:46, Jesus replied, and you experts in the law, woe to you, because you load people down with burdens they can hardly carry, and you yourselves will not lift one finger to help them. Oh, you mean it's impossible to follow the law? The very law that you supposedly yourself, when you were still one as God in heaven, gave to the people and enforced on penalty of death most of the time throughout the entirety of the millennia of the Old Testament? Sorry you changed your tune, earthly Jesus, at 32 years old. They were just trying to be consistent with the entire history of this religion and this God. Not an incorrect understanding of this, and this is why I made my entire video on the Pharisees, because Jesus is the one who is off base here. Not defending the Jewish religion or the Pharisees, but insofar as that religion is real and the things that were written down were correct, they were in the right. Clearly. But okay, let's end with, move over here. The worst verse, I think, is in all of Luke, which comes to us from the parable of the 10 minas. This is in Luke chapter 19, and the whole parable is there, but then it ends. The last line of the parable comes to us in verse 27, and in it, Jesus says this, but those enemies of mine who did not want me to be king over them, bring them here and kill them in front of me. Now, this is in parable form, so it's not to be taken literally. And I think it's important to point that out. I think many people just quote this as if Jesus said this about actual people in front of him. He didn't. But in many interpretations of this parable, and again, if you go back to Mark, we are told Jesus uses parables to confuse us, essentially. So keep that in mind here. But in many interpretations of this parable, it is Jesus comparing himself to the nobleman. In fact, the beginning of the parable states this, because he was near Jerusalem and the people thought that the kingdom of God was going to appear at once, he said this parable to them. A man of noble birth went to a distant country to have himself appointed king and then to return. Sound like anyone familiar? And then he calls 10 servants and he tells them to put this money to work, and then he judges each for how they have done with their commission, which sounds a lot like Jesus talking about his followers and the authority he has given them over creating more to follow, making more disciples. So at the end of the parable, when the nobleman is dealing extremely harshly with who? Those enemies of mine who did not want me to be king over them, people that then would reject Jesus as Christ, kind of like the people in the towns whose fate would be worse than Sodom and Gomorrah, is even in parable form. Is it, but I forgive you? Is it, but you go to jail? Is it, but I'm disappointed in you? Or is it, bring them in front of me and kill them? Make no mistake about this. We have a consistent representation of the God of Yahweh. Believe in me or else. Follow me or else. It looked a little different in the Old Testament. If you weren't for me, you were against me. If you weren't a Jew, you were an enemy, and I will destroy you. I will have you genocided. I will have you enslaved. I will have you tortured. And many people think that that part of Jesus in the New Testament is just completely gone because he also says a lot of other stuff, most of which, the pretty stuff, he's only saying to the Jews, by the way. Sometimes he says a couple things for the Gentiles, sure. But most of what he has for anyone who will not believe in him is this. So hopefully you have seen this warlord of Jesus in Luke as clearly as I do. That's my take on Luke. That's what I think is important to understand about this book. It is probably the most tough book to reconcile social justice warrior and also militant warlord. I mean, that's a hard thread to sew. But regardless, we have Luke working hard to make this story, as much as he could change it, palatable to a Roman audience for what was potentially a Roman patron, if not even for the selfless sake of trying to spread the gospel to Gentiles and make this religion grow. We have a change in Jesus's character to get him back in control. Instead of falling in overcoming depression and fear to pray in the garden, he chooses to kneel. Instead of talking about being forsaken, he makes the choice to commit his spirit into the hands of the Father. And many more examples like this that show the obvious agenda of the writer of Luke. It's so fascinating to me to see this evolution of a historical figure into the God that many people today, billions of people today, actually believe they have a personal relationship with. I could go on like this for 15 hours, so I'm going to stop myself, but these are the problems with the Gospels. These are the problems with the religion of Christianity. And just wait. Be here next Thursday. Let's talk about John, and you can really see where the wheels start to come off. So thank you for being here. Have a wonderful day. If you didn't watch my video on my 1-year anniversary, go back and check that out. I'll see you on Sunday with a new video, and until then, keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support, my Iconoclast and Boris GVI, Jacob, Joe, Martin, Oliver, Perry, Rokkit, and Shawn, my Humanist heroes, Jarrod, James, and Kristi, my Atheist advocates, Caleb, Imposter, Jeff, Jeffrey, Karen, Sparky, and Todd, as well as all of my secular scholar patrons. If you believe in the mission of the channel or you just enjoy the content, please consider joining these fine people. Thanks and have a great day.